For those that don't know me, my name's Lauren, or some of you may know me as Wrack Wonder when I dabble in fan fiction. I recognize some of you. I don't recognize others. That's okay, we're fine. But if you are in the right place, you do know the beautiful people are upstairs, right? So I always tell my students, if you're supposed to be in a math class, now is the time to run away. But for those of you in the right place, this is Whiskey Nights, making Wynonna Earp medieval. When I was first asked to do this, I was excited, but I also questioned, why would you want me to do this for 45 minutes or so up here? And they were just like, go for it. And I think the reason that this connection kind of started is because of this. So at the end of season 3, as most of us should know as we're watching the show, Bulshar embeds a sword into a stone staircase, which for most people alerts them to another rather famous story of a sword being embedded into stone. This is when people started tweeting me like, hey Lauren, it's like King Arthur. And I was like, yeah, but the thing is, I'm willing to guess, I'm willing to bet that the writers don't have a copy of Le Morte d'Arthur sitting in the table in the writer's room. I could be completely wrong. So when I was thinking about how do I make a medieval Wynonna workshop, how do I make connections between the show and this very impressive long period of history, I was slightly concerned about what I could possibly do, and the only thing I've really come up with is that both medieval people and Wynonna Earp like a good dick joke. This is the infamous nun picking fruit from the penis tree. A beautiful memento from the medieval period. The thing is, today I want to talk about, when we're talking about the show, I want to talk about people, places, and objects. I would like to thank my moms, Jen, for buying me a sword yesterday, so I actually have a fun object here to play with. But before we begin, guys, who can tell me what an archetype is? Don't make me do all the talking. I teach 18-year-olds, I will wait you out. Give me what's an archetype, guys? I'm staring at my girlfriend. She looks so scared. It's okay. Yes, in the back.
Or a trope.
Thank you. Yes, a theme or a trope. It's like patterns. And the thing about us as humans is we like patterns. We like predictability. It makes us feel good. How many of you guys watch murder mystery shows? Maybe you're like my mom and you pause it 30 minutes in and you're like, here's how everything's about to go down. And it's like, thanks, Mom. I kind of wanted to see that unfold, but I guess it won't anymore. But we as people like to be able to do that. We also like when archetypes are subverted, and Wynonna Earp is really famous for doing that well. So we like when there are sort of archetypal scenes, tropes that we've seen before, and turned somewhat on their head in a way that maybe changes the gaze or changes the characters within. As I said, Wynonna Earp is really good at doing that. How many of you guys can hear the music from the first one? I'd let you sing, but don't want to upstage me. Here's like a very clear example of what Wynonna Earp is doing with archetypes. The image on the left from Gone with the Wind, you don't have to see the movie to know what that image is telling you. It's some sort of romance. It's a little bit overwrought and very dramatic. You also don't need to watch Wynonna Earp to identify those same characteristics in the Way Hot image, but the fact that it is Way Hot is what makes it such an interesting subversion of the tropes. This is why when we play with medieval tropes, this is essentially what we're doing. We're going to look at the archetypes, look at the tropes, and then see how they exist in Wynonna and whether or not they can maybe clarify some new meanings for us to take into the show. Before I get into Wynonna, very brief history lesson. I know it's not the most exciting. You guys, the medieval period was a beautiful, beautiful time. And the people were very serious and sacred. I spoke to Emily yesterday. I mentioned to Emily that I was doing this panel, and she was like, I'm excited to hear cool medieval stories. And I was like, I just have butt and dick jokes from the medieval period. But for those of us maybe not familiar with this era, we are talking about the end of the 5th century to the 15th century, or the fall of the Roman Empire, to the death, at least in England, of Richard III. He was recently found buried under a parking lot. They paved paradise, and they put poor Rich down there. For those who are confused, here is my gay timeline for you. Listen, I've got you, okay? I've got you. Fall of the Roman Empire. We were with Lucy Lawless and Xena, right? We can picture it. Medieval period. We are with Katie McGrath and Merlin. And finally, the end of the medieval period into the Tudors. We're with lovely Natalie Dormer in the Tudors. So for today, we are going to be hanging out with Katie McGrath. I'm sure a lot of you are upset by this. I'm sorry, but here is where we are. Here's the hard part. I feel so bad every time I say medieval because there's no word in sign for medieval. But here's the hard part about the medieval period. Sorry. The medieval period lasts for 1,000 years. That's a lot of time to cover. It's as if we said from 1900 to 2000, everything was the same. And it most certainly was not. So when I talk about the medieval, can anyone give me any of your own perceptions of what the medieval is? Anyone, when I say medieval, what do you think about? Don't say me. Castles, thank you, Boo. What else? Knights, knicks. What else? The Black Death, that really fun thing that happened in 1348. Guys, be careful of rats and the fleas upon them, please. If you find yourself with swelling in the armpit or groin, leave. Get out of this room. What else? Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Yes, yes, yes. Our perceptions of the medieval don't actually come from that time period. For a lot of us, they come from movies. Monty Python is a great example. Medieval people were just like us. They liked things like sex. They liked to pull their partners back into bed in the morning. They bathed regularly. They had feelings, but our idea of the medieval, again, has been lost and reinterpreted because of another era altogether. After the medieval period, the Renaissance thinkers started to get interested in ancient Greece. They weren't really interested in the time that just happened before. It's very much like for a while, we all forgot about the 90s because it's a good thing to forget about, having been there, and the 80s, and now we're all like, I love the 90s. All my students dress like I dressed as a child, and it confuses me. So what happens? The 19th century happens. Put your watch away. Oh my gosh. The great thing about Gentleman Jack, for my purposes today, is that Gentleman Jack has introduced a generation of queer people to the intricacies of 19th century coal mining. It's very important because in the 19th century, here's what happens. The Industrial Revolution happens. People start stealing Amlister's coal because they need to have coal to run their factories. People start moving into urban centers. People stop living an agricultural life. And so what happens when we're living in tumultuous times is we look back and we look at other eras as idyllic. It's the way people look back at the 50s and they're like, oh man, that must be great. And I'm like, you must be straight. And very white to feel that way. People in the 19th century looked back at the medieval period and they said, oh, people lived outside and they made their own objects. And there were codes about how to live. There were gender codes and we like those. And so they became increasingly obsessed with the medieval period. They also started editing medieval texts. Until the 19th century, a lot of medieval manuscripts were kept in random libraries libraries that like to catch on fire. For example, the library called Ashburnham House caught on fire. I mean, guys, come on, right? So we get people editing text, which means people were reading medieval text. King Arthur goes from being the stuff of very wealthy people in court to being the stuff of children's literature. King Arthur enters pop culture in the 19th century. The medieval also became popular in architecture with the Gothic revival movement. This is the William Wallace Memorial in beautiful Stirling, Scotland, and there is no better symbol of 19th century medievalism, because what better way to honor the greatest hero of Scottish freedom than building him a giant sky penis? It's exactly what they did. Our perceptions are molded by the art scene. Many times when we think about what medieval people looked like and dressed like and felt like, we look to the pre-Raphaelite artists. I mean, Florence Welch was there. It was awesome. Right? It's the Industrial Revolution, Florence and the Machine. So, as all this is going on, as this arts movement is happening, there's also social change, because pop culture and social change always go hand in hand. What was happening is that people started to become very concerned about the way women were behaving. For the first time, women could get jobs that paid them enough money that meant they didn't need to get immediately married. So you had all these women doing crazy things like riding bicycles and wearing pants. They called them the new women, and they often were depicted riding bicycles. When people look at the medieval period, they started thinking to themselves, that's when men were men and women were women. That is not entirely true, except they were getting very nervous about the way these women were behaving. And so has anyone read the poem, The Lady of Shalott? We heard that. That is a poem about a woman in a tower who literally looks out the window at a man and dies. That is your 19th century perception. Keep her in the tower, keep her in the tower. But we also have other poets like William Morris writing something called The Defense of Guinevere, which sort of looks at Guinevere and is like, hey, she had a pretty bad situation that she had to deal with. Maybe we shouldn't be so hard on her. So you have these two aspects going on. King Arthur, the medieval in popular culture, women sort of starting to change their lives. And at the same time in the United States, something else was going on. As white colonists began settling and destroying the West, the Western genre as we know it was in its infancy. Some of these people you might recognize, like Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid, Sitting Bull, Annie Oakley, There Is My Best Friend, Calamity Jane, Wild Bill Hickok is up there. All of these people are running around doing what it is that made them famous, except they didn't stay in the United States. Instead, they took the show on the road. Here is a poster of my beloved Annie Oakley, the greatest sharpshooter to ever live, as played by my mother in her High School Musical. Hi, Mom. She's not watching, it's okay. She'll watch later. They put together a Wild West show, and the Wild West show didn't stay in America. It went and traveled, and they took hundreds of performers with them, including all of their horses and bison, or in America, their buffalo, whatever that is. Here's an image of them on a boat sailing across to London, where they performed for Queen Victoria herself. So when we think about the medieval and the Western, they were essentially born at the same time into popular culture. And maybe that's why they share so many tropes. Good guys and bad guys in strange open spaces and all sorts of interesting characters and such. Because I don't think we can actually separate them from each other anymore. So while we're playing with archetypes, this is the one medieval image I think I have that's not of a butt or something like that. While we're playing with archetypes, a lot of times people ask me, okay, well, in Wynonna Earp, then Wynonna must be King Arthur, right? And I'm always like, no, I'm sorry, she's not. But they're like, but she's the main character. And here's the thing about King Arthur. I want you to think about the Arthurian legend as a patchwork quilt. It has no real beginning or end. It is influenced by many cultures and many languages, from Latin to French to Welsh to Yiddish. That's a weird one, I know. So when we talk about who is Arthur, we are really relying on a series of stories that all come together. And the thing about King Arthur is, at the beginning of his life, he's very active. He does things like he pulls swords from stones and from lakes. He defeats Rome because he feels like it. He gets married, which, as we know, does not go wonderfully for him. But after all that, Arthur essentially sits down and lets his boys do the rest of the work. And so in most King Arthur stories, he's back home. Usually he's being sort of annoying and doesn't want to have his festival meal until something cool happens. He's that one, like, I want to watch TV before we eat. And so Arthur, while an important figure, is also a passive figure who looms very large. And I think if we're talking about who is Arthur, we're talking about Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp, in real life, of course, had a very colorful and busy life. As a lawman, at one time I think he was actually arrested. He entered the movie business at one point, but Wyatt Earp on the show is not really present because he's dead, which we can't get mad at him for that. But his curse extends to every single character. That idea of something like King Arthur being a once and future, of sort of a return. All of his heirs inherit this birthright from Arthur, and so even though he is not present, he is always on the mind. It is the Earp curse, and he is the original recipe Earp. When we're talking about Arthur's best friend, however, I am sad Tim isn't here, but I'm slightly relieved he's not here to hear this, because Doc Holliday is Sir Kay. And here's the thing about Sir Kay, good old Sir Kay. Sir Kay begins his life as a great warrior. He's right there with Arthur. He's his best friend. Sometimes he's his foster brother. I don't think they kissed, but I'm really hoping for a Wyatt Doc kiss. And Emily was just talking about making everything queer, so like, why not? But once the French get a hold of Kay, and this is a thing, when the French get a hold of anything, it becomes super sexy and super problematic. So thank you, France. You made my PhD research much more interesting. When the French get a hold of him, Sir Kay becomes the lovable mess up. He means well. He really does, but he's the guy that tends to say the wrong thing or put his foot in it, and other people have to rescue him. Now, before we get down on Doc does mean well. A lot of what he does because he wants to save people, or he thinks he's doing something that'll help the group, or he's, worried about his mortality or the fact that he's going to hell, and so he acts out, like becoming a vampire. May not have been the best idea he ever had, but he had his reasons for doing it, and Sir Kay is very much like this too. He means well, he makes a mess sometimes, but at the end of the day, he's Arthur's boy, and he's there until the very end. Arthur tends to create his own enemies as well. The most famous of these is Sir Mordred, who is sometimes his nephew, sometimes his son, but really an enemy that is of Arthur's creation, and I think Wyatt does the same thing with a lot of the characters that we see as villainous. Someone like Bobo started off very loyal to Wyatt and was sort of at the wrong place at the wrong time. Willa is very much, a victim of her upbringing, where her father, who was by all accounts not the best dad, sort of molded her into a semi-homophobic psychopath. Willa. But really, she didn't have the best upbringing. She was, kidnapped and brought up in a cult, but really this is all because of this looming Earp curse. So in a lot of ways, Arthur is his own worst enemy, and I think a lot of ways in this show, Wyatt brings trouble, even though he might not mean to all the time, and his actions have of repercussions for everyone around him. So this finally brings us to the woman that's brought us all here, who is Wynonna. And again, I don't want to wedge these people into little Arthur boxes. We're just looking at character types and seeing if we can find any connections. I might be a little biased because I spent 4 years of my life writing 100,000 words about one fictional character, and that's why I have trouble sometimes, and I'm okay in getting help. Oh God, but that's the longest relationship of my life with this guy. This is Sir Gawain, Knight of the Shower Cap. And I think, I'm telling you guys, the 19th century was weird. But I think of all the characters, of all the medieval figures that we could associate with Wynonna, Sir Gawain stands as maybe the closest. Has anyone heard of my ex-husband, Sir Gawain? Just because I told you. I'm like looking at my girlfriend, like, better know why not? No, you do, I know, you do. Because it's all I talk about. Gawain, I've always felt, is the most human of Arthur's knights. He is intensely loyal. He is a great warrior. But he's deeply flawed. He makes really big mistakes, but he's not necessarily apologetic for them either. A lot of times he sort of owns the fact that, like, hey, I'm not the greatest in this moment, and that's just how it's going to be. Gawain loves very deeply. He loves women. He loves his dogs. He loves apples. And he really, really loves his little brother. His little brother Gareth is his favorite person, even though Gareth doesn't always love Sir Gawain. In Le Morte d'Arthur, which is the big sort of Arthurian book that comes out right at the end of the medieval period, Sir Lancelot accidentally kills Sir Gareth, and King Arthur says, no one tell Gawain, because this will be the end. He will lose it, and this will be the end. And that's exactly what happens. Gawain loses it, to the point that the Pope actually intervenes, is like, can you guys like simmer down a little? And Gawain's like, no, Pope, I will not. And I think we see in Wynonna this intense humanity. She's driven by many different aspects, but at the end of the day, it always comes back to Waverley, and we always see her sort of come back. We get all these amazing scenes of them together talking. Waverley is her light, and I think it'll be really interesting in season 4 to see Wynonna without that light and what that looks like for a time. Wynonna is a character that follows her own code within the codes of other people, and really every aspect of her life, whether she likes it or not, is motivated by family. She is the Earp heir. That's her birthright. She loves her sister. She would do anything for her sister. And in very much the same way, Sir Gawain functions as this loyal, human, flawed, but ultimately a figure that is loving. Because Wynonna functions in her own in sort of her own, with her own code, that's why she works so well with someone like Nicole, who's also following her own code. Sir Gawain didn't always get along with his fellow knights. Sometimes he sort of made a mess of their lives, but it's why he works so well in conjunction with them. So for example, this is an image of Sir Gawain and Sir Lancelot and villagers throwing poop at them. I think this might be a great plot line for episode 7 in season 4. Just like, poop throw of purgatory. No, oh my God, the poor cast. Like, don't tell them I said that. But when we talk about sort of this idea of codes of behavior and oaths and the way people behave, knights are famous for having codes, right? The chivalric code. And Wynonna is a show that really intensely includes police officers in the military. They are a big presence. Nicole, I think, offers some structure to people like Wynonna and people like Waverley, who maybe without that sort of help would fly off the handle and do whatever they want, like crazy chick with a gun. I think Dolls also provided this structure. This morning in the panel, we were talking about how Dolls really saw Wynonna in a way that no one else did, and maybe sort of gave her a set of tools to expand her own talents in a way that no one has before. I've always thought the love triangle, which is the only love triangle I've ever liked on TV. Usually I hate them, but I've always felt that Doc is sort of that tie to Wynonna's past in Wyatt, and Doll sort of provided her that future, that possible, here's a way to go about this. And so this is our structure, this is our justice. We have Knights of Purgatory. They just happen in this case to be the police officers and Black Badge running around town. The thing is, we associate knights with really good behavior and doing things well, and knights could freestyle, they could do what they want, so it's not as rigid as perhaps we're remembering, but important nonetheless. There are a lot of really diverse women in Wynonna Earp, and they behave in a varying manner of ways. One of the things I love about the women on the show is they occupy a gray space. They're not necessarily good or bad. We might at first think they're villains, and then they turn out to be heroes. And I think in much the same way, what we're looking at is the archetype of Morgan Le Fay, he's a crowd pleaser for numerous reasons. Katie McGrath. Morgan Le Fay is an example of a woman that's ahead of her time, that's got in a patriarchal bullshit land, who is trying her best to hold on to any power that she has in a world that does not want her to have any power. In early stories of Morgan, she's a healer. In some stories, she was kicked out of court because she got pregnant as a teenager, and the knight that did it ditched her, and Arthur and Guinevere said, "You can't stay here anymore." Morgan Le Fay lives in a place called the Val Sans Retour, or the Valley of No Return, which is the coolest place name ever. And what she does there is she captures adulterous knights and punishes them. She's so metal. I just love Morgan Le Fay, right? When Arthur finds out that his wife and his best friend have been having an affair, he actually goes to Morgan's place and just sort of has like a breakup sequence. Like there's no ice cream or rom-coms, but instead he sort of like goes hunting and he hangs out and he's like, "I'm so upset, my bro and my girl." And she's like, "Dude, you gotta go back and take your kingdom." He's like, "I just wanna hunt some more." And so we get Morgan at the very end as the person that takes Arthur home to Avalon. So Morgan Le Fay has gone down in history as a villain, as a sorceress, as a temptress, and I say, what is wrong with all of that? That sounds good. So we have people like Kate, who's slightly morally ambiguous and is a vampire, and we don't always know whose side she's on, or Rosita, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time and dealt with anxiety the same way I did and just got way too many university degrees. You don't need that many. Willa, I know Willa's complicated, but Willa's background, she had a pretty tumultuous childhood, and even Constance Clutie, we know, she's sort of, in the end, we had that sad scene where she's just a burned out head, and everyone's like, I'm so sorry for you. We get that idea of, instead of thinking of these figures as black and white and villain and hero, the show doesn't really see them that way. And I think when we look at Morgan Le Fay, we can't look at her like that. And medieval people, as I said earlier, were much more complex than we give them credit for, and really did see women in their complexities. Morgan Le Fay allowed them to write about sex and desire in a world where that wasn't always okay to write about. And she differs from other women in that a lot of women in medieval stories hide behind trees, and they just wait for a night all day, and they're just sort of waiting and waiting, and then they pop out and like, "I've been waiting for you." Morgan doesn't wait, and neither do any of these characters. Speaking of patriarchal bullshit, here's Wynonna outrunning a very phallic worm thing. I love that they ended like this with just a giant phallic symbol. I don't want you guys to think that I've forgotten about Waverly, because I haven't. I never do. Before we talk about Waverly and what Waverly may represent, we need to talk about Waverly where she's gone. Waverly is in a garden somewhere, but that garden is within a forest. And in the medieval period, forests were famous for being the dwelling place of outlaws. So have we heard of Robin Hood and his merry men? Just a bunch of dudes living in the forest together. Thank you, Boo. What were they doing out there? I support it, whatever it is. I wanted that treehouse from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, when I was a kid with Kevin Costner. I still do. The rent, though, in Toronto, that treehouse would be like $2,000, and there'd be no AC, and there'd probably be rats or something. But the forest in the medieval times was a place where people lived and worked too. It could be a place owned by the king, but it could also be a bit of a dangerous place. When we think of forests and stories, we're actually talking about things like fairy tales too. Think of all the fairy tales where characters go into the forest and they learn things or they see things or they meet people and they learn a lesson along the way and then they come out changed. I just made all my students learn about the hero's journey, and a lot of times forests are these sacred spaces that people have to venture into in order to face something. The forest is where the other world is. We don't really know what the other world is or what it looks like. Some people can see it, like a set of stairs in the middle of the forest, and some people cannot see it. You don't always know when you're in it. You might be in it right now. No, you're in a Etobicoke. I'm sorry. We are not in a sacred forest space, unfortunately. But in Wynonna Earp, a lot of times the characters are out running around in the forest. I don't think this is an accident. Not only is it beautiful and natural scenery of Alberta, but forests play a big role in the plot, right? Dolls is afraid of the forest. Willa comes out of the forest and she's kept there for much of her life. Forests are where people go to learn lessons. Forests are where people go and they don't always come back. Waverly, come back. So we've got Waverly out in this forest space, which is a very sort of medieval way of telling a story of knights venturing off into this space and learning their lessons. But I know what you're all here for, and you're all here for the objects. You're here for the sword. And so we've talked about forests. Let's talk about the object that brought us here in the first place. That sword embedded into that staircase. In the Arthurian legend, there are actually two swords. The first sword is pulled from the anvil or the stone, and then Arthur breaks it because he didn't play nicely with his toys. He breaks it, and Merlin says to him, "Go toss it in that lake over there. I think this will be okay." The image of the sword coming from the lake, my art history friends call that vagina lake. And this is why you should never hang out with art historians. They are foul human beings. But the sword may be the same sword, but it's from the lake. It's from this lady of the lake giving him the sword that we get Excalibur. This is Excalibur. This is the famous sword. Two swords. Two peacemakers. These objects bestow power. These objects recognize power. The fact that Wynonna can handle Peacemaker and shoot Peacemaker tells us something about her. The fact that Arthur is able to wield Excalibur tells us that he is worthy to be king. Peacemaker bestows its power upon the heir. But don't forget that it's not Wynonna who pulls the sword from the stairs. It's Waverly. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for Waverly? Waverly, our champion. As I said, the sword indicates power of some sort. The sword tells us about identity. The fact that Waverly was able to pull the sword, the fact that Waverly is considered the champion, is really interesting considering Waverly began the show in an identity crisis. She spent her life while Wynonna was away taking online courses, right? Because she thought, why can't I be the heir? Maybe if I learn ancient languages, I will one-up myself. Meanwhile, Wynonna's off in Greece, and this is why I think post-secondary education may not be all it's cracked up to be, because Wynonna just swung in there and took it, and Waverly's like, I just went to university for this. I shouldn't go to school, please, or else I won't have a job. But Waverly, who struggles with her identity, Waverly Waverly, who doesn't even know if she's an Earp. Waverly, who is a very baby queer woman at this point, who is sort of coming into our own, or her own, I should say. Who is Waverly, if we want to give Waverly sort of a medieval archetype to think about? And I think Waverly is Galahad. Galahad is the greatest of all the knights. Galahad is the one that exemplifies the 5 knightly virtues the best: generosity, fellowship, charity, courtesy, and chastity. Thankfully, Waverly is not into chastity, no shame. But I know this audience, you thirsty folk. Waverly doesn't seem to sort of benefit or think that that's something she needs in her life. But in terms of all the other attributes, her loyalty, her kindness, her generosity, this is Purgatory's most popular person. She is the moral tentpole a lot of times of the show. If a character is mean to Waverly, we know they are no good. That's sort of what signaled, I think, the audience being really sort of suspicious of Willa at first. We were like, oh, she's really mean to Waverly. Even though she had such a hard life, we were like, there's something up with that she's not that very nice to Waverly. And so as Galahad is the best of them. Galahad is the only one that obtains the Holy Grail. The rest of them try. Gawain is told by a hermit, dude, you need to repent. And he's like, nah, I don't feel like it. And he goes home, which is, I feel like, is a very Wynonna thing to do. But Galahad is the one that makes it. The search for the Grail is not a search for a cup, unless you're Sean Connery. I suddenly remembered my Charlemagne. The search for the Grail is an inner search for the self. As the knights go on their Grail quest, they discover whether they are worthy or not worthy. And so we have Waverly as this champion figure, as this figure of purity. And again, Waverly is a very complex figure. I don't mean purity in the sense that she's never done a bad thing in her life, because my God, that would be boring. But pure of heart, you could say. And so the question then becomes, so what is the Holy Grail of the Wynonna Earp universe? And I really think the Holy Grail is Alice. They've talked before about how Melanie's pregnancy is sort of the best thing that's ever happened to the show. And I think having Alice out there really adds this extra layer of motivation for all of these characters. If we look at the show in season 2, Waverly is the one who spends the most time with Alice. She gets the most screen time with her. She carries her to safety. It's not Wynonna and it's not Doc. It's Waverly. Waverly is worthy. She carries Alice. Peacemaker recognizes her in some way. And while she has trouble shooting it at first, there is this sense that Peacemaker it's sort of like, okay, this is something special. The other person that recognizes, of course, Waverly's worthiness is Nicole, and she always has, right? When we're talking about archetypes, when we're talking about the way that the show sort of flips these archetypes on its head, I've said this before on Twitter, but I think the fact that the show makes Waverly and Nicole the guardians of Alice in the end, the guardians of this Holy Grail, the ones that carry her to safety, that sort of is a beautiful kick in the ass to that horrific idea that queer people should not be around children, that queer people should not teach children. Suckers! Teaching your kids. Here we have, it's a powerful image, I think, of this carrying this holy object to them, to somewhere else. Of course, the question, will Alice return? Who knows? We don't know that, but that she lingers out there, much like the Holy Grail lingers out there, is sort of a sign of what's to come, I think really gives the show sort of a different edge. We know that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Medieval people saw heroes mostly as dudes riding around in armor on horses, because only rich people could afford armor at that point. So really, like, rich dudes riding around. That sounds horrible. But that in their stories, that's who they saw as their heroes. We know that heroes look different, right? hey man, like, you know, this is heroic at a level that I don't think many of us will ever obtain. I once saw Melanie at Fan Expo holding her little guy in one arm, wearing stilettos, signing an autograph with the other, and I was like, worship. I was like that. I mean, that is extraordinary. What we're looking at essentially is a modern telling of a story that's been told over and over and over and over and over again in new ways with a new gaze. For gaze. Yep, got it. Emily said at San Diego Comic-Con that the Peacemaker sword might be missing, which is okay, because swords tend to go missing and then they tend to pop up. So I recommend they look in the Purgatory Community Pool or the grotto or something like that. Melanie also, when asked, Melanie has sort of, she seems a little bit nervous about the sword. Which, girl, no, that's the best. But she sort of made a comment at that Comic-Con that maybe Wynonna never sheathes her sword. And I know Melanie's upstairs being wonderful, but I just want to get this message to Melanie somehow. The source of Excalibur's power is not the sword, it's the scabbard. The Latin word for scabbard is vagina. No, and I'm like, I'm just saying, like that. So you have to have like these pieces. Excalibur doesn't work. So you've got King Arthur riding around with Excalibur, but when the scabbard goes missing, it stops working. This is why Morgan Le Fay is always trying to steal the scabbard and not the sword, and this is why I think Morgan Le Fay is a big old gay, because she just wants that scabbard, right? And that's coming soon to my Patreon. No, I shouldn't advertise up here. But the thing is, I just hope Melanie knows that there are some good things about sheathing your sword once in a while, Melanie. Ultimately, when we look at Wynonna Earp, as I said, we are looking at thousands of years of storytelling. We are looking at the subversion of beautiful tropes. And we are looking at stories where the sacred exists within, and ultimately the fact that love, as cheesy as it is really our best story of all. We've talked about it over and over and over, and we're going to talk about it over and over until the sun burns out or the Russians come, whatever comes first. I feel like we might be okay in Canada a little longer, so guys, let me know if you need to hook up with a safety zone or something like that. Heroes look like this to medieval people. Heroes look like us, and ultimately they're both sitting at round tables. Thank you. Thank you. My students don't do that at the end of class. They just, Miss, is this on the exam? Yeah. Do you guys have any questions or comments or anything that you would like to ask or say or just hang out or tell me? Please read the syllabus. It's been posted for 6 months. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, she'll bring a mic.
Oh, yay. Wonderful.
Hey, thank you. Give you $5 for that later.
I totally love this, by the way. I mean, like, obviously everybody...
Did my mom pay you?
For you all? Yeah. Thank you so much. You're so good.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if you had any comments on the use of the tower as symbolism in the show. Like
Belshar, like like the card, like the symbol of the tower and things like that.
Well, and also the manifestation of the stairs that leads to we don't know what.
That leads to we don't know.
Seems to have a tower-esque
thing
attached to it.
I think one of the interesting things about the stairway and sort of the entrance to something in terms of how we can connect it to the medieval and just sort of storytelling in general is it's got that very sort of otherworld idea, the fact that some people can see it and some people can't. I think yeah, I think that's like sort of an interesting place to play with when people can see it, when they can't see it, why that is. In terms of the actual structure, Wynonna Earp went a little bit biblical last season, which they're brave for doing that because that's not easy. The fact that the tower seems to involve a sword that's on fire, like it should be no surprise that medieval people were very into religion. The church shaped a lot of their lives, and sort of this idea of they may be at the entrance to a sort of heaven type thing. The medieval people wrote about heaven a lot. A lot of times they saw it as a place sort of across a river. So there's a really beautiful poem called Pearl, and it's about a man who loses a pearl in his garden and then falls asleep and has this allegorical dream. And the pearl is actually his lost daughter, and she sort of shows him New Jerusalem, which is their idea of heaven, and it's across the way. It's sort of across this river, and he can sort of see it. And it feels a little bit like that, I thought, with sort of the staircase and this tower, and it's sort of far off, and some people can go in and some people can't go in. It very much feels like that sort of medieval perception of who's getting into heaven, and the fact that they all live in purgatory. I mean, for medieval people, like that's where everyone was going, purgatory forever. So I think that sort of interesting connection. That's something I'd be interested in asking the writers about, if they just sort of toss that in, or if they're all doing sort of Bible study. I'm not sure with that crowd, but something to do with that. Any other questions or comments or heckles?
Bravo.
Thanks, Dad. Thanks, Dad. Thank you, guys. I just want to thank all the volunteers and staff working here at ACON, and I also want to thank all the organizers for including fan panels and fan-produced panels. There was an awesome panel on psychology this morning. It's real. This fandom is extremely interesting and smart. I'm not talking myself up. Like, this morning's panel blew my mind about just how brilliant people are. So I really thank them, and I hope that's something we see at ErperCons in the future. Read more medieval fic, because it's got penis trees in it. Thank you.